Hi, I'm Victoria Peat and I'm going to show you how to make this great herringbone strip using the foundation paper piecing method. I'll be using one of my foundation paper piecing templates and I will share with you the tools that you need, how to prepare your template and how to add the fabrics to make this really precise, great strip. The set of templates that I have available features the herringbone design in 11 different widths, ranging from 1 inch wide to 6 inch wide finished. This downloadable PDF pattern also has an illustrated guide on making the strips longer or shorter to suit the needs of the project that you're working on. The pattern is available on my website or via my Etsy store. There are links to both in the description below. So I'm going to be working with a 4 inch wide finished herringbone strip, as you can see here. So I've got this printed out on standard printer paper, but you could use specialist foundation paper if you prefer. Before you get going, do make sure that you measure this 1 inch test square to make sure that it measures 1 inch. Because if it doesn't, your finished strip won't come out the width that you are looking for. So what I'll do is I'll take my an acrylic ruler and I'll find a square and I'll just place that over the top to make sure that that sits entirely within a 1 inch square on my ruler. If it doesn't, I'll need to go back to my printer settings and just make sure that I'm printing actual size and I'm not doing fit to page or scale or any of those things. So that's the pattern all ready to go. In terms of other bits and pieces that I have, I've of course got my sewing machine and I have my iron and a pressing surface. I also quite like to use a wooden block just to cool my seams. I have my fabrics. I'm just going to use 2 different colours for this herringbone strip. I've got 2 different rotary cutters. One I'm going to use for my fabrics and one I'm going to use at the end. And you'll see when I come to that. I've got an older cutting mat that I like to use because I don't like to cut directly on my main cutting mat because I find with foundation paper piecing, I'm cutting in the same place time and time again and it wears the mat. So I find it easier to work with an older mat that's more inexpensive to replace or a smaller mat that's more inexpensive to replace. I also have my add a quarter ruler and I have an add an eighth ruler. I don't need that for trimming seam allowances on this particular pattern, but it has a nice beveled edge and I'll use that as I go along. I also have a glue pen and I have a blade just for cutting out my pattern. I have a standard straight stitch foot for my sewing machine. And I've got a couple of acrylic rulers. So that's where I am and I think I'm ready to get going. Okay, so I've got my pattern here. I've just marked up where I'm going to place each of my fabrics. So I'm working with a black and I'm working with this pink here, which is an Alison glass print. And I've just marked up so that I can remember as I'm going along which parts I want in the black. I've done K for black and P for pink. To start with, I'm going to just trim around the outside of my pattern. You can see here there's all these solid lines. The solid lines are all stitching lines. And this dashed line around the outside is where I've marked 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So I'm going to trim this back, but I'm not going to do it on the dotted line. I'm going to go just to the outside of this dotted line. What this means is that I'll be able to trim back to the dotted line once I've finished doing all of my piecing for this particular strip. I'm using a craft knife here, but you can of course use some paper scissors or you can use an old rotary blade that you might happen to have saved for using for her. Right, so that's all that cut out. Throw my paper on the floor. And now I have my paper ready to start sewing. Now, if you like, what you can do is you can pre-fold along each of these lines. So everywhere there's a solid line, you can fold back along that line, pre-crease those. I'll just do another one so that you can see. So what you can do is you can fold each of those lines all the way down. That might be an easy way for you to work. Or you could do, if you get those little round spiky wheel things, can't think, menopausal brain, can't think what they're called, on a wheel with spikes on. And you can go along all of those lines and that will pre-perforate all of these lines. I'm not going to do either of those today. I'm just going to fold as I go along. Now I'm going to start off, we're going to sew in order. So we've got pieces numbers 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth until you get to piece number 15. And we're going to sew everything in order. So we're going to start with piece number 1. Now, the piece of fabric that you need for piece number 1 needs to be the size of piece number 1 here, which I'm just going to scribble over the top of. Plus the piece of fabric needs to be 1/4 of an inch bigger on all sides. So this one here touches the outside edge of the pattern piece. So you've got your 1/4 of an inch here, but then you also need to allow for the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. This is in no way accurate. Out on each of these sides. So your piece of fabric needs to be big enough to allow for all of that. Now, what you need to do is when you're working with fabrics, this very first piece, you need to put the wrong side of the fabric against the wrong side of your paper. Now, I'm working with a solid fabric. That's an absolute bonus if you're doing foundation paper piecing as a beginner, because it doesn't matter which is the right side and which is the wrong side. But if you are using a print, do make sure that this first piece goes with the wrong side on the paper. Now I'm going to put a little piece of glue. So we've got our triangle here, that's piece number 1. I'm just going to draw this on here so that you can see from the wrong side. Here's the location of our triangle. And I'll flip it over. So this is on this side of the pattern and this is on the other. What you want is to get this piece of fabric sitting on top of where that triangle is going to be. So I'll place my dab of glue there and placing this wrong side against the paper and pressing it flat. We're then moving on to piece number 2. I'm just going to iron this to get rid of these marks that I've drawn so that you can see what I'm talking about. Because I've used a heat erasable pen. So now we're going to be joining piece number 2. And in order to do that, we're going to fold back on the line between piece number 1 and piece number 2. This is where I'm going to use my add an 1/8 ruler because it's got the nice beveled edge where it gets thinner on one side. You can use a piece of cardboard, like a postcard or something like that. A bit of old cereal box is normally okay as well. I'm going to place that along the line. And I'm going to fold my paper back along that line here. And this is the excess fabric that we don't need for the black. What we do need to do is leave 1/4 of an inch seam allowance so that we can sew this black fabric to our next piece of fabric. This is where I'm using my add 1/4 ruler. It's got this great little lip on the edge, but I place that lip up against the fold on the paper and it really does butt up against it. That makes it nice and easy and secure. I much prefer it to working with a standard ruler. But if you don't have a standard ruler, don't be put. If you don't have an add 1/4 ruler, don't be put off. You can use a standard ruler. You can just place your 1/4 of an inch line against the fold on your paper and trim. The challenge with a standard ruler is that when things get a little bit more complex, they get a little bit more bulky and they're a bit less stable. So I always prefer to use my add 1/4 ruler. So I'm butting that up against the edge, and I'm then just going to trim off this excess that we don't need anymore. We come back onto this side. We're going to be doing piece number 2 here, which is this piece here. And again, we need to be allowing 1/4 of an inch seam allowance across this way, and this way. So whilst this strip here measures 1 inch wide, we actually need 1 inch plus 1/4 of an inch either side, plus a little bit of wriggle room. I like to give myself to give a little bit more space. So I've cut these strips 1 3/4 inches wide. So we've got this folded back. We've got this nice neat edge. Let me draw on this side so that you can see what we're doing. So this is, can't see, the lights are so bright. So this is our piece here that we're adding. Okay, so I'll flip that back. So piece number 2 is here, and that looks like this on this side, plus your 1/4 of an inch seam allowance here and here, plus this 1/4 of an inch seam allowance here to match with the black. So what I'm going to do is I've just cut a big long strip. I'm going to place this on top, matching the raw edge on my pink strip with the raw edge on the black. Place those right sides together. And you can see here how this piece number 2 extends out towards the left. So you've got your fold here, piece number 2 comes out this way. don't be tempted to take your raw edge of the black and place that right up to the end of this seam allowance on the pink, because you can see underneath here, the pink isn't extending far enough. And when you flip everything out this way, the pink fabric's not going to be quite long enough. So you always need to be looking at the size of the piece of the pattern that you're looking to cover. So we'll slide it across a little bit so that this sits entirely on top of the pink fabric. We're then going to take this across to the sewing machine. Now my sewing machine's been set up with my straight stitch foot. I'm using black thread and my stitch length has been reduced down to 1.8. This will just mean that it's easier to remove the paper at a later stage. So I've brought the pattern over with my 2 bits of fabric. I've made sure that my raw edges are still matching. I then will flip open the paper and slide that underneath the presser foot. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew along the line between 1 and 2. But I'm actually going to also sew through this seam allowance at this end. So I'm going to start just outside the dotted line. I'm going to sew directly on top of the line. And when I get to the line that is between 1 and 2 and 3, the next line of stitching, I just want to go 1 stitch further on. There's no need to backstitch. So what I've done is I'll try and get the light. Okay, so we've gone from the outside edge, we've gone through the seam allowance, along the line, and just past the seam allowance, just past the stitching line on the next line. I'm now going to press this. I like to press it flat first, and then I'll press away. So try and press perpendicular to your line of stitching. Not so bad when you're dealing with larger pieces, but when they're tiny, you just need to make sure that you're pulling entirely perpendicular, not a bit to the left or a bit to the right. So giving that a press and allow that to cool. And generally, I'll allow that to cool for as long as I can before moving on. Some fabrics are better than others. Some are a little bit more bouncy. When that's cooled, we can then bring it over to our cutting surface. We've turn it the right way around. We've done 1 and 2. We're now coming on to piece number 3, which is also pink. But what we first need to do is cut back the seam allowance on piece number 2. So I'm going to fold back on the line that goes between 1 and 2 and piece number 3. So I'll fold back here. And then I'm going to take my add a quarter ruler again, butt that up against the folded edge and trim back. So we don't need that black. And then the pink is the piece of fabric that I'm working with. So this time we'll mark from this side. So piece number 3 is a strip that goes along here. So from this side, you can see piece number 3, plus we need a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you've got your 3 plus your seam allowance. So your piece of fabric, this time, we're going to again go right sides together. And I'm going to place this trimmed edge here that I've just trimmed. And I'm going to place that on top of the raw edge of my strip. And you can see here that this is the edge of my piece. This is approximately where my seam allowance is. So the fabric on the underside needs to sit to the left of where my seam allowance is going to be. So just double check, have a look, and you can see that it extends far enough out. I then do the same thing as I did before, pick it up, take it across to my sewing machine. And at my sewing machine, I'm making sure that my raw edges are matching. And then I'll just flip over my pattern piece, slide that underneath my presser foot. This time we're starting in the center of the block as opposed to on the outside edge. And I'm going to start my stitching the length of 1 or 2 little stitches beyond, beg your pardon, beyond the start here. And you've got your crease line as a guide. dropping my needle down, dropping my presser foot, and then I'm just going to stitch on the line. I'm stitching on the line, and I've got to this solid line here on the outer edge of the block. I'm going to sew through the seam allowance and just off the other side. So I've sewn just before this line starts, all the way along the line, through the seam allowance and just off the edge. Give that another press. And then flip it back. And allow that to cool. So as I say, some fabrics are a little bit more bouncy than others. So depending on the fabric, depends on how long I leave things to sit for. But generally speaking, I'll do multiple strips, or I'll do all sorts of different sewing at the same time, and I'll just allow that to cool and then come back to it. Okay, so now we need to get rid of this little tail here. So I'm going to just cut in line or just to the outside of where this pattern piece is, so I can then release that. And then, if you lose track, count 1, 2, 3. I've done 3 pieces, so I'm up to piece number 4, and I've marked that up as black. So I'll then grab my black fabric and I'll trim back the seam allowances here. So I'm doing piece number 4, so I take my ruler, pop that on the line here between pieces 2 and 3 and 4. This is the line we're stitching next. We fold back along the line. I'll take my add a quarter ruler, pop the ridge up against that fold, and trim back the seam allowances to give myself a nice neat edge and a nice neat 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So this strip here is coming up to this point. So I know that my black strip of fabric, I'm going to use this straight edge, needs to be as far as this plus my 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So I'll place that on top of the black fabric, right sides facing if you're using 2 different prints. So I can see that my black is extending further than where my seam allowance will be. Pick that up, bring it across to the machine. Flip my pattern piece over, and I'm going to start just on the outside of this dotted line, through the seam allowance, along the line, and then I'm going to stop just beyond the next solid line, running perpendicular. So then just over the line. So I've gone through the seam allowance, along the line, all the way along, and then just over the next line. Press it flat, warm up the fibres, and then flip over. Just making sure that that fabric's running perpendicular to the line of stitching. And then I'm going to trim off this tail here, just on the outside of the dotted line. And now we can move on to piece number 5. Again, if you've lost track, 1, 2, 3, 4, we're going to piece number 5. I'm going to fold back between the line, on the line between 3 and 4 and piece number 5. The counting's a good thing to get into the habit of if you're planning on doing a lot of foundation paper piecing, because when designs get a little bit more complex, there are little pieces that you can miss along the way, and those can make a big difference to what you're making. It might be a part of an eye or body or a particular part of a star-shaped design, and if you miss that one tiny little bit, it changes the overall design and you can find it quite frustrating. So it's a good habit to get into to count where you're up to. Okay, so piece number 5. You don't have to do this drawing. I'm just doing this so that you can see as I'm working. So this is the next piece here, and we're doing this in black. And the joy of double-sided fabric. Just turned that round so that I can create this kind of shape with this strip. I can place that on top. Slide a little bit more this way. So when you're working with these strips, you can cut individual strips for each section if you like, or you can do as I've done here, and I'm working from one big long strip. And I find for me that works, and I waste slightly less fabric. Okay, so again, back at the sewing machine, raw edges matching, flip the paper underneath, starting just the other side of that solid line. Needle in the down position and sewing all the way along the line and then through the seam allowance at the other end. Give that a press. Allow that to cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue on doing these. I'll speed up the video so that you don't have to watch it in real time. So you can watch along at high speed, or you can just skip ahead to the part where I have finished all the piecing and I show you what I do when I trim up. Right, now this piece here is piece number 13, and we're sewing on the line each time. This one here, this is the line that we're going to be sewing along. We're actually going to be starting at this edge and we're going to be sewing in this direction. I am going to sew through the seam allowance at the end, but at the beginning I'm not going to. I'm just going to start a couple of stitches before the line starts, because this line of stitching here is going to be covered by this line of stitching, or secured by this line of stitching between 12 and 14. So once I've done piece 13, I'll come to do piece 14, and this one will go through the seam allowances at either end. If I were to sew all the way through the seam allowance at the start and the end, this bit here, I would have to rip the paper back from the fabric, because it will go through the fabric on the underside, and it just makes this a little bit less secure, and it just ruins the foundation a little bit. So I'm only going to start a couple of stitches before this line, and then I'm going to stitch along and then through the seam allowance at the end. So here you can see I've just done a couple of stitches before. Loose on the underside. We'll do a couple of stitches before and then all the way along the line, and then a couple of stitches, all the way through the seam allowance at that end. Get rid of this excess black. Actually, I'll put that in my save pile rather than my scraps pile. It's the joy of foundation paper piecing. Whilst you do get some wastage, and this is what I've wasted by sewing this strip, so it's relatively small pieces. I do keep my larger pieces for something else, because what you'll find is that you'll have things like this starting triangle that you are working with, or these corner ones, and you might just find a piece of fabric that's exactly the right size. Okay, so we're going to go on to piece number 14, and this one is going to sew through the seam allowance at either end. We're going to go through here and through here, and that's where this line of stitching here is going to secure this line of stitching that we did for adding piece number 13. So we fold back on the line as normal and trim back. Now, if I'd sewn all the way through this seam allowance here, when I pulled that back, I would have to rip through the paper, and I might make this stitching a bit less secure. So I'll trim a little bit back. And now we need a piece of the pink fabric, and I might be a little bit tight. Let's see if that fits on there. Good grief, that's a little on the tight side. So I'm placing the raw edges on top of each other like every time, and then I'm just going to pull back the fabric on the top just to try and eyeball and see whether that's going to fit. And I think it might just fit. So I know that I've got a little bit of a wiggle room because the edge of the paper isn't the exact edge of the pattern piece. So I know that I've got a couple of millimeters, or like a 1/16 of an inch around the outside. So I think I've got just enough. I mean, look, I've got all this fabric, so there's no need to be tight with it. But that's part of the joy of foundation paper piecing for me, is I love it when I can use all the little pieces and I find one that's just right. I always think of it, it's a bit like my dad and his work shed, is that he keeps all sorts of screws and bits and pieces for just the right moment. And I always think slightly the same way about foundation paper piecing, is you keep your decent size scraps, and you just never know. One day that scrap might just be perfect and exactly what you're looking for. Right, the moment of truth on whether this will be big enough. And press back, and I'll look at that. It's just the right size. If it wasn't the right size, I would see the paper coming out from underneath the fabric. That was very lucky. But if ever you're not sure, two things you can do. One, ignore and cut a big piece of fabric, or if you think it's going to work, stitch with a longer stitch length, try the piece of fabric, and if it works, then great. If not, it's easy to unpick, because I will tell you now, unpicking these 1.8 length stitches is not much fun. And it kind of makes a mess of your foundation. So if you're not sure, cut a bigger piece of fabric, or do your first line of stitching longer, and if it is right, then you can go back in and stitch again over the top of it. Right, the triangle corner, I can pop that in there. And do just double check when you're sewing, and you can see where I've trimmed, not so much with this shape, but sometimes you cut a little bit beyond where you think where the raw edge is, and what you don't want is a little nick in the fabric. You know, where it pulls open? You don't want that in your finished block, so do just be careful when you're trying out pieces of fabric. So through the seam allowance at either end. And press that open. And I'm going to just remove this tail and save that for something else. Pop that with my black. Those are my scraps. So now we have the entire strip. The 4-inch herringbone strip has now all been pieced. All the lines you can feel have been stitched on. And when you flip it over, the design looks like you expect it to look. Now what I like to do is trim everything up, and I will do that up to these dotted lines just to get rid of this excess. So I'll take a decent sized ruler and I'm going to place 1/4 inch line on my ruler against the solid line around the outside edge. And what this should mean is that the edge of the acrylic ruler should sit on top of the dotted lines on the side. And I will trim using an old rotary blade. So when my blades get dull, I save the blades and I put them into an old handle. Mine's broken, so I keep this for this specific use because I don't use it day in, day out. And I will put those blades in here because they're a little bit less sharp, but they're okay for going through a paper foundation. So I'll get my solid line on the solid line of the pattern, or slightly to the, if you're right-handed, slightly to the right of the line, like a hair's width. Then I'll place my hand nice and firm on the top because I want to trap the fabric between the acrylic ruler and the cutting mat. And then I'll take my blade and I'll cut through to remove. Swivel it round and then reposition and trim. Now just make sure that your hand that's holding the acrylic ruler is nice and firm because this gets quite bulky because there's lots of seams, so you really don't want it to move when you're trimming. And if you've got a longer piece that you're working with, try and place your hand, cut, reposition your hand, cut again. Do my final side. Trim that off. Close my blade. And I would go in and just trim off all these little threads. But that is a finished, what do we say, 4-inch wide herringbone strip. Now, what you're going to do with it, you might be using it straight away, which is great, but you might not be. And you've got these little flappy pieces here, these final pieces that you put on. What you can do is just add a tiny bit of glue, your sewing wash away glue, and press that down, either finger press it down or just pure iron just to hold those in place. Particularly useful tip when you are working with pieces with larger flappy bits. They do tend to just move around and it just keeps your block nice and neat whilst you wait to sew something else with it. So there's your 4-inch version. I've got the other 2 versions here, or 2 different colorways. These ones were the 1.5-inch wide. So you can just see the difference that you can, different effects that you can get from the strips, either by interspersing a white as opposed to a black, using a multitude, rainbow of colors, or just using 2 colors. And of course, don't forget that your strips can go up or down. You can alternate having strips going up or down. And of course, they can go left or right as well. They're a really versatile strip, which are great for accents in your work, or they could be a whole project. It's entirely up to you. You could use them in borders. You can use them on a cushion or a pillow or something. They're really versatile. But hopefully that's been helpful for you and you feel confident to go ahead and sew your foundation paper pieced herringbone strips. If you're looking for FPP templates, then don't forget to check out what I have available on my website and in my Etsy store. All patterns are designed to print out on A4 and US letter paper. There are links to both stores in the description below. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this video useful, then go ahead and click the thumbs up and leave me a comment. I would love to hear from you. Click on the subscribe button to be kept up to date with all my latest videos. Thanks again for watching. See you next time.